Today we're going to jump into Dash once again. The main reason why is because with Oldhim leaving, we're going to have like a pretty new meta game in a sense in CC. The main reason why is because hybrid Dash came into the scene. The main reason why is because during the Everfest season, there was an issue where typical mid-range Dash, which had been popular up until then, this was mostly through pretty notable players like Matt Rogers, for example. There was an old game plan of trying to get out your pistol items every single game using Tome of Fiendal along with High Octane and having mid-game pivots, and you played a pretty standard mid-range deck. You actually ran a lot of non-boost cards in it. It wasn't control, but it wasn't aggro. You could boost sometimes if you just had extra cards and you didn't like need to take damage to keep them, or if it felt like a good time to pivot and you were comfortable using Achilles. But most of the time you'd use Achilles for Tome, and you would play CNC, Sync, Fate, sometimes in the main board, and that was pretty much it. And the problem with that list was it just like lost really hard to Rune Blades, had no answer to Starvo, and Prism was extremely difficult, although probably the best matchup it had out of those three. And Chain was also pretty rough as well, although you arguably did have some potential to fatigue it. So Hybrid Dash was actually a response to this problem of, well, we need to race, but we also need to be able to counter Guardians, and we don't want to just auto-lose to things like Oldhim and Control Starvo. And so Hybrid was kind of an answer to that, where you were able to have an aggro package. So this is like this list that really hasn't changed since then, except for adding new additional cards as sets continue to come out. But just having an aggro main board. So if you're against something like Viscerai or Chain or Prism, you could race. But then if you got paired into a Guardian, back in the day, 2 Induction Chambers and 2 Purifiers was enough to win you the game. You didn't really need anything extra. And that changed a little bit when Iyslander came onto the scene. It was kind of weird. It was forced to change out of necessity, with Iyslander being pretty much like the tier 1 deck at the time. And it meant that Dash all of a sudden started losing really hard to Guardian. So I remember going to the San Jose calling at Worlds, and I didn't make day 2, and I think all of my losses were to Guardian, which is really odd because up until then, it was considered almost a free matchup for Dash into Oldhim, for example, because it was just like, oh, they play really defensively, they're trying to slowly fatigue you and grind you out of the game, but your end game is better than what they're trying to accomplish. So if you think about your end game is, once I'm in the very late stage of the game, I'm able to consistently deal, let's say, 12 to 20 damage a turn, only using blues. Whereas the point of Guardian is that you want to grind someone down to their second cycle, get them in their blue like pitch stack, but the Guardian blues are so much better, right? So your Guardian blues are probably all going to block for 3. At the very least, if you're Oldhim, you can swing Hammer for 4 with the blue, which is pretty much better blue rate than anything that you would have in this deck, right? Like, let's look at 1 card blues, even in Dash, that's 2 damage. 1 damage. These aren't even technically 1 card blues because you need an additional resource to play them. But you can see the problem, right? So Guardian would kind of just grind most decks out of the game. But with Dash, you actually wanted all blues. You wanted all blues. You wanted to be in that very end state of the game. And so you just beat Oldhim like almost every time. However, it changed a lot with Oldhim becoming more disruptive, more proactive. And this list really started to suffer. It was like the necessity. If you were going to be playing Dash at an event, you pretty much had to be playing Hybrid, unfortunately. Now, with the problem with this is that your slots were so tight. Your control package arguably wasn't that good. It was arguably just barely good enough that if there was a matchup like Dory, Assassin, or Guardian where you needed the control package, you could get away with it. We put in the Remembrance recently with the Baltimore meta just because of the existence of Warhorn. And before that deck existed, you would just run 3 Fates, 3 Syncs, and 3 Immovables. And having 9 D-Reacts was like sometimes just barely enough. And your aggro package is good. And I mean, Dash's cards are mostly vanilla, but she does have some tech in her kit, and you pretty much had to make a concession one way or another. At the RTN that I played in, I expected a lot of Ranger, and I actually cut payload for CNC, but the problem was that meant that was now just in my aggro package, and there was a lot of matchups where CNC was not that relevant, but I still had to run it anyway, and I had to run the risk of boosting it away because it was now in my aggro main board. But now that Oldhim's gone, you don't have to play that way anymore, and so I'm gonna give like 2 example lists of things that I'm going to start testing, start trying out. And I think that they're actually pretty interesting. So the first one that we're going to jump into is back to the old school Talishar Dash. wombat dash, whatever you want to call it. Hyper aggressive. You're really trying to burst your opponent down. The problem with wombat dash, it's like hyper aggressive dash, Talishar dash, was that it's super easy to fatigue. However, I do think that with like a little bit more skill and knowledge of how to play around fatigue, I don't think it's that much of an issue, especially with the current state of the metagame. Right now, your control decks are essentially going to be Ranger and maybe Bravo. And Bravo, we do have an answer for Bravo, but Rangers, for example, I pretty much have no ability or capacity to fatigue you. Most of the decks that can fatigue you are going to be decks that are going to be saturated with 3 blocks and going to have probably, I would at least say like bare minimum of like 6 life on armor. The purpose of this is aggro deck for metas where you are wanting to not block very often. This is one where you can get away blocking with maybe 1 or 2 cards here and there if you have like a bad off turn. And that is a nice thing about Dash, is having the concentration of class 3 blocks, but this is a deck where you don't really want to be blocking. And we're really leaning into that specifically with BIOS Update. So BIOS Update's really big, in my opinion, because this card fixes a lot of issues with fatigue. You just didn't have enough damage to get over the like finish line in a sense. And if your opponent was able to run you out of Pounder, run you out of any of your items that were starting on the table, you would have a really hard time winning the matchup. However, with things like BIOS Update, you can high roll into multiple Tekla Pounders, for example, or a Tekla Core, and things like that are actually pretty much the difference between winning the matchup and losing the matchup in terms of decks that from turn 1 start full blocking with the intention of fatiguing. We also are mainly making this with the assumption we're going into an aggro meta where decks can't reasonably do that. So if we're going into like a fully aggressive meta, for instance, this deck absolutely slaps. So you're going to cash in Hardened Cross Trap as soon as you can for something like a Max Velocity, which is really easy to get off with Hardened Cross Trap. You could run Foundry Heart and just use it to Talishar. That's another option as well. But Foundry Heart is in the sideboard. I like Hardened Cross Trap going second, but Tekla Foundry Heart's also fine going second. I like Foundry Heart for matchups where you want to block more, or matchups where you go first in an aggro race, because then you're going to need to take damage to keep cards when your opponent goes second, and Foundry Heart is just really good for saving some life and blocking breakpoints. This is what I talked about. There's a little bit of interesting tech in the kit. So you can have a pretty standard lean 60, but you do actually have some options. So for example, we can start here with T-Bone. T-Bone is really good into things like Ninja, into Ranger, decks that have really fragile equipment with Blade Break that needs to be activated for the deck to work and function. So you can imagine against Azalea, if you're able to T-Bone out their cross trap, their deck becomes a lot weaker. A lot of the deck is centered around the cross trap, and without it, they're just going to have to blind Azalea most of the time. That's really difficult. If you can spike New Horizon against Lexi, the game is entirely different. Hitting Mask or Tunic against the Ninja is also really good. So the thing is that before you would have to make, in hybrid, you have to make the decision, well, am I going to run 0 to 60 or am I going to run T-Bone, right? Because T-Bone is not good in all aggro matchups. But if you were in hybrid, you would have to make the choice. But here, now we don't have to, right? So we can say most of our games are going to be running 0 to 60 in yellow. But if we're in a matchups where T-Bone is better, we just make the swap. And now we have that flexibility. Another really big one that I think people have actually forgotten about entirely was Signal Jammer. So there were 2 anti-Runeblade cards, I would say. I think this is meant more for Runeblades than it is for Wizards, although it does work really well against Kano. But there were 2 in Everfest, and there was Dissolution Sphere and Signal Jammer. A lot of us, including myself, thought that Dissolution Sphere was a better one because it would prevent Runechant damage, and with Vincent, that may be relevant. It would also prevent her Flail. So if Vincent does become strong, becomes meta, then we can look at Dissolution Sphere again. But that card ended up being really bad, and it was actually Signal Jammer that was a better one. It being a 0 cost meant you could fetch it off a Spark. It's a blue pitch, and it's just really clean. The Runeblade could play around Dissolution Sphere really easily, especially Viscerai, by just stacking Runechants and passing, and they could sit on them the entire time. But Signal Jammer is a lot more disruptive to Runeblade specifically, but it also works well against Kano, and it also works really well against something like Azalea. If she can only play 1 pump instead of 2 or 3, that's huge. So this card is actually really good and is actually a pretty good meta pick. Command and Conquer is in here. This is a good anti-Ranger tool. It's a good anti-Runeblade tool in my opinion as well, especially against something like Briar or Viscerai. Those are decks that care more about the arsenal. Once again, going back to hybrid, if you did actually want to play this card in your aggro package, you would have to make the concession somewhere else, right? There are some aggro decks that can pretty much play without Arsenal. Things like Fi don't really care as much, and actually once you get to mid-game against Fi, they actually rarely Arsenal at all. And so that card isn't as good there, unless if you're going second. But then you can also decide, if I'm going second against Fi, do I actually include Command and Conquer in my list? So we just have options now, which is really nice. It's really great. Everything else is pretty standard. We are running Induction Chamber and Plasma Pistol. If there are some matchups where you are pretty concerned from turn 1 about fatigue, then just having Induction Chamber and Pistol, in my opinion, in an aggro package is enough to actually withstand fatigue. The fact that late game, instead of you having to burn boost cards, let's say if your opponent, because you're going to get your opponent normally down to 2 or 1. Even in matchups where you pretty much get milled out really quickly, you do push enough damage to get them that low. The problem with Talishar Dash just not running Chamber at all is that once you fully block out and Pounder's gone, the pistol's not that interesting. It's not very strong. And if you're not running high octane, you have a lot of problems with it. And if you have Talishar, then you don't even have a weapon anymore. So the problem then is that your opponent's at 2 and you have a bunch of blues in your hand, you're just not taking enough cards. Whereas if your opponent's at 2 and you have all blues, like let's just say you just have the classics, right? You have like a blue throttle, blue 060, blue zipper hit, whatever. If you were to boost all those cards at your opponent, they can full block and not take anything, and then you lose 3 more cards in deck. But if you at least have Induction Chamber, you get to rip 2 cards, let's say with the 0 to 60. So you pitch the 0 to 60, and now that represents 2 cards that your opponent has to block with. If you just boost in 1 and 2 more times, the whole hand's gone. And if you can boost 1 more time, so on a pretty simple 4-card hand, or even a 5-card hand, you pretty much have guaranteed lethal. So into fatigue matchups, Induction Chamber is normally enough to get you there. So we just have the single one here. And then we also have some high octanes if you are going to bring in this package. It's also pretty good against Bravo. Now, you are going to have a hard time against Bravo for sure. You know, you should be able to race effectively well into Bravo. Basically going to be going into a meta where you're expecting to not have to be blocking a whole lot, where you're primarily going to be racing. There is one more interesting build that I did actually brew up a little bit, and it's Jumpstart Dash. Now, this isn't super unique. I remember Hayden Dale from Arsenal Pass made a Hanabi Blaster list that was using Hyperdriver. And so it's pretty similar. The idea is that you're able to have pretty much like pitchless hands, where what you're going to do is you're going to play a 0 cost, get a resource from Hyperdriver, use your Foundry Heart to turn into 2 resources, and then you can play 2 1 costs and then put a counter on Hanabi Blaster. I think that this can go even further though, and I think that you can start playing mid-range dash, or like a more block-oriented version of aggro dash, where you're able to pivot on more off turns by not only having that, but also being able to have basically 1-card 6s. So if you have 0 to 60, you're able to boost it and then use the resource to send your pistol. I am not a very big fan of Hanabi Blaster. I understand that 5 damage is more than 2. Well, I guess if we're being honest, so 5 damage over 2 turns, right? Because it takes 2 turns of steam counters is better than 4 damage from the pistol. And the overpower is interesting and sometimes game relevant. The problem I have with it is that, well, I have a lot of issues. The biggest one is the fact that you're forced into a certain method of playing. Sometimes to keep the counters coming on the weapon, you do have to keep really inefficient hands. I don't like having that restriction on a weapon. I think you can have some restrictions on cards, right? So max velocity is really good, right? But obviously a lot of times, sometimes it's just correct to block with. You're just in a position in the game where you just can't take the damage. Your hand doesn't work well for it. And you're like, okay, at least this card gets me 3. And you have flexibility, right? Which is the whole point of the Flesh and Blood core system. But I don't like having that restriction on a weapon. It's personal. I think people can come up with really good Hanabi Blaster lists, but I'm interested in trying out a Hyperdriver list that's going to use pistol. So the idea here is that you can send a 0 cost, banish to Foundry Heart, send a 1 cost, and then send pistol, right? So for instance, if you have 0 to 60, we'll say red jumpstart or maybe a zipper hit, and then you can pistol afterwards using your Foundry Heart resource, you're looking at a 2-card hand for 11, which is pretty insane actually when you think about it. Or you can just keep a 1-card hand with 0 to 60 or any of the 0 costs in the pistol, and then you can get up to a 1-card hand for 6, right? Which is really, really good. Also, having the Hyperdriver makes a lot of these 2-cost cards a lot more achievable to play. But in this list, it's actually pretty reasonable. So if you have max velocity and 3 0 costs, you can just play it straight out of the hand because you'll use your 1 resource that you get from the Hyperdriver to the Foundry Heart. And then it also lets you play all the jump starts, which as long as you have the driver out, it's just extra copies of Zipper Hit, and Zipper Hit is one of like the best cards in aggro dash. So I like this list a lot. And then you're able to play some more finishers, so you can play Overblast, some of these more cost restrictive cards that because of Hyperdriver, your curve just smooths out a little bit. You'll notice we're not doing the BIOS update or the extra items, so this list is more interested in blocking. So this is a list where For instance, you can block with 2 cards, and then on your turn, you can send a 0 cost into, let's say, Throttle, right? That's another really big one. That's the general idea of this. Sideboard's super lean. That's the other thing too, is that this has a higher starting deck count, and you don't have some of the go-tell effects from things like Pounder or Bias Update. You will actually end up being a little bit more susceptible to fatigue. The other thing too is that this list is super explosive, and so even in the decks that are kind of trying to fatigue you, your damage output's normally so high that most decks can't actually handle it. If you're recognizing that the person's trying to fatigue you and you're just boosting every card that you have because you're panicking, you're doing it wrong. The thing is that their opponents like blocking with like really great cards just to preserve their life total. And so you can use that to your advantage and start taking off turns to start to be a little bit more careful with the kind of hands that you send at your opponent, because your opponent can't stack defense against you most of the time, unless they're on some very specific kinds of heroes. And so because of that, you can actually have the liberty to use some of your life total because they're going to be blocking with so many of their power cards, because at that point they're winning through a different game strategy that you can take the time to be like, okay, I'm not going to send my max velocity yet with all these blue cards. I'm just going to like pitch them or do something with them. Maybe you just play out a blue boost card, right? And then pitch one of them, not boost it, and just pass turn. My opponent will need to full block it or else they're not playing correctly anymore. And then you can punish them on that. So if your opponent then is like, okay, well, I'm going to pivot back onto offense after trying to fatigue you, then you just punish them even harder because they have already weakened their deck a lot. And then once you repivot back, if they try to start blocking you again, they can't do anything because they weren't confident on what strategy they wanted. This list not having some of those cards, specifically these extra pounders and things like that, you could be a little bit susceptible to fatigue. And so just because of that, we're just upping the deck count. If you want to lean it down, you can also do that. And the sideboards is really clean, honestly. Like it's almost nothing. It's just an induction chamber if you think you're going to be playing against a fatigue matchup and you don't want to start Hyperdriver. Or you can actually put it in your deck, start Hyperdriver, and then just go fetch it out with Spark if you don't think you're going to boost it. And then Signal Jammer is a one-of against things like Runeblade, Sarcano, or Azalea. And you just throw it into your blue item count down here, and it's just your clean Spark for 0 target, and that's it. So those are just two quick versions of Dash. I can get some gameplay up on the channel, hopefully. We may have to revisit this, but these are just 2 initial ideas for you to try out. So thank you for watching. Until next time.